Hi, welcome to the bathtub. This is the Mutual of Omaha Animal Kingdom episode because I can't. Every time I film this 3 times now, either the bird goes crazy or Lucky goes crazy. So anyway, hopefully we'll get through. We'll get through this Animal Kingdom episode. Lucky's downstairs, and Dodo is out. Anyway, that's what happens here. The old masturbator's back. I never went away and never stopped masturbating. Call Granny, call the kids, tell them the old masturbator's on TV, on the YouTube, doing what he does best. Grandma will know. She's been there. She knows what masturbating was like back in the pre-tech generation. So we're talking about two writers who are very similar and very different to my mind, which are M. John Harrison and Christopher Priest. They were published as science fiction writers and fantasy writers in the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s. They have a number of similarities. This is M. John Harrison's second novel, 1972, I believe, The Pastel City, and Christopher Priest's second novel, Fugue for a Darkening Island, published 1972. I think that's 71. I read this when I was about 15, so that's about right. And I did not read this until now. This is the first time I've read it this past week. I want to say some similarities between the two writers. They both published much of their early work in some of the old Ted Carnell anthologies, and then Michael Moorcock's tenure at New Worlds, which was quite a substantial tenure, where he published a lot of interesting writers and helped them do what they wanted to do. And Harrison may have been more connected with New Worlds than Priest, but they both published in there a lot. And Harrison was their book critic for a long time, wrote some very funny book reviews and good book reviews for them for a long time. And so that's sort of similar. They also both came out published in very genre format books. They weren't non-SF or non-fantasy writers. This is really a science fantasy novel, and this is a very much a Wyndham. That's who I was thinking of. John Wyndham, like futuristic collapse of society, or John Christopher, future collapse of society novel. Not totally unusual writers, but both very literary in different ways. And they also published in the genre a lot, and were known in the genre more than they were outside the genre. And their career trajectory is quite similar. As they just kept publishing a novel or a book of stories every few years, and they got slowly better reputations. They were kind of disdained, unfortunately, by the stupid literary crowds that valorized the bookers and gave all those terrible Booker Awards and all these terrible writers. But over the years, they've slowly, I think, both gotten much better reputations, and they've kept working well into their late 70s, or I think they must be late 70s, early 80s by now. A couple of old farts, but they're still writing some of their best books. The last ones I've read of either of them have been very good. And I kind of went back to read their early ones, because I like the early ones just as much as the late ones, the more estimable novels. And they have all the same strengths and pleasures in the bathtub. So anyway, I thought I'd talk about that. So there's very similar backgrounds, similar career trajectories. Probably the two writers of that generation who are probably best known in England for being associated with SF or fantasy to any degree. This is my M. John Harrison's second novel. We talked about their first novels maybe a year or two ago now. And I always wanted to kind of keep reading through their early books because I haven't read all of their early books. This is Harrison's first of a Viraconium series. His first novel was called The Committed Man. We talked a bit about it. It was a kind of post-apocalyptic nightmare. Very funny, beautifully written, like all of Harrison's books, and a little kind of complicated, hard to follow. There weren't any real characters that you could identify with or feel much compassion for. They were such a weird group of people and lots of weird events and time lapse and type jumps, but it was worth reading, and I enjoyed it. This is a little better. It's better for the main reason we have one central character whose name is, I always forget this. I've done this 3 times now. Chromis. Chromis. I don't have my glasses. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Tegius Chromis. Is that what they call him? And he's one of these far future super swordsmen. He's like a Elric or who else? But it's in the far future, so it's not Conan. And he's got magical abilities, or he's a super fighter or something like that. Anyway, he's been living a long time, and he's part of this far future realm, which is set in this kind of super far future. Like it reminds me quite a bit of a writer I didn't know when I first read it, which is Clark Ashton Smith. And I get that. I'm sure I know Harrison was very big on Peake, and he'll talk about Mervyn Peake, and there's a lot of similarities between the prose writing of Peake and Harrison. But I'm pretty sure he must have read some of this. He certainly had an influence on Michael Moorcock, the Elric novels, Stormbringer, and so forth, that Harrison's kind of adapting and making a lot of interesting changes to in this first book. He must have been quite young when he wrote it. And it's set in this far future. There's Vericonium is this far future city. Jack Vance is another writer. It reminds me of the Dying Earth series. This far future which is filled with all these old artifacts and these old civilizations that no one knows how to work anymore. And there's a lot of that in this too. I really enjoyed reading it the second time more than the first. Harrison, as most people know who have read anything, writes this kind of beautiful, ornate, complex prose. It's beautifully written and very visual, very sensory, and it's a good story. It's a little slow in parts, and some of the sword fights go on farther. I can do with like one sentence to describe a sword fight, and they go on a little long for me, but it's part of that genre in a way, and it does a lot of things with a genre that most other people wouldn't have done. It's a very interesting and enjoyable book. I want to give a quick passage, just read a quick passage, just to give you a flavor, a tiny taste of Harrison's prose. I picked both of these at random. This is when there's been a war and these foreign invaders have come in and attacked Vericonium, and Tedious Chromis is going into the town. Refugees packed the Vericonium road like a torchlit procession in some lower gallery of hell. Chromis steered his nervous beast at speed past caravans of old men pushing carts laden with clanking domestic implements and files of women carrying or leading young children. House animals scuttled between the wheels of the carts. The faces he passed were blank and frightened, overlit and gleaming in the flaring, unsteady light of the torches. He was at a loss. He thought that they were the timid and uncommitted of the city, driven away by fear of the clashing factions, holding no brief for either side. He entered the city by its 12th gate, the gate of Nig, and there was no gatekeeper to issue even the customary token challenge. Every sentence has got visuals and sensory material like this. You can see the influence he had on... there's a number of writers. I'm sure that that guy George R. R. Martin must have read a lot of this, and he has a lot of influence on the Gene Wolfe. I mean, it really reminds me Gene Wolfe's. Those of you who've read those the Torturer series, the Shadow of the Torturer series, I can't remember. Anyway, that kind of, you're in a futuristic landscape and you see all these emblems of this past civilization, but you don't quite know what they are. Nobody knows what they're traveling through. And Jack Vance, of course. Anyway, some great writing. It's a really good read. I recall, Harrison goes on to write what's many people, and I agree, consider probably the first of the cyberpunk novels, which was Centauri Device, which had a huge influence, I think, on a lot of the cyberpunk writers. And the second one of this series, the second of the Vericonium books, A Storm of Wings, I recall really liking more than I liked Pastel City, though I like them both. And I want to go back and reread all of these. Anyway, so that's Harrison. I wanted to also talk about Christopher Priest and his second novel, Fugue for a Darkening Island, which I got to say I was just absorbed. Every time I pick up a Christopher Priest novel, I sort of once I get past the beginning, it takes me a little while to get into his books. And as soon as I get past a chapter or two, he just somehow really wraps you up. I was trying to think of writers he reminds me of. He reminds me a lot of John Christopher and John Wyndham, who do these post-apocalyptic sort of novels. And then he has a lot of Wellesian kind of flavor to him. And he's clearly influenced by Wells, because Wells shows up in his books, I think 2 or 3 times. Pure mountain water, post-tech generation, no alcohol, no fake substances, no artificial substances, and no carbs. So this is set in a future falling apart England, like a lot of those Christopher novels and Wyndham novels. And there's a racial migration story going on here, which is somehow England has fallen apart, and there's a lot of Africans who have come to this country, come to live in this country, and they've come on ships. And you don't really know, as often at the beginning of a Christopher Priest novel, the first few chapters, you really don't know what's going on. And you really don't know what's going on until about halfway through. And that's one of the things I sometimes have trouble with a Christopher Priest novel. And we find out, I don't want to tell you what's happened, but it is basically this country that's kind of, there's a large migrating forces from people from Africa. There's lots of racial conflicts between the English whites and the Africans who are moving into some of their neighborhoods. There's violence on both sides, and there's a slow breakdown of the social order as you find out what's going on. The thing about Priest is his writing is totally different from M. John Harrison. It's less specific, it's much more narrative, and he has a way of telling stories. I don't know anyone else who does it. And in this story, he jumps around between 3 or 4 different time streams, which I didn't think would fit together. One is just the one that society is starting to break down and people are starting to move out of their neighborhoods because of the violence. The other one is the young man, the narrator, the central character's, I forget what his name is, the central character, his sexual awakenings. As a young man, his sexual experiences and his sexual experiences with his wife. And then another narrative about him and his wife and daughter trying to get away and trying to find their way in this horrible world. And then after he loses his wife and daughter, what happens to this man and what kind of people he gets involved with. I just totally was absorbed in it. And again, he does something I don't even quite know how to describe it. It's a very different type of narrative telling. He's best known, as we've talked about, as for The Prestige. There's a similarity to that one where you're going back and forth between these two magicians, and there's one of the characters who you don't really realize is a twin, but you sort of, if you're looking, you can see it. And then you don't get that information until you've gone through the book a little ways. There's always something like that in one of his books, and it takes a while to kind of get into this first chapter or two, and then they're just very absorbing and very different. There's also something Priest does. We talked about endings. The ending of the Harrison book is good, but the ending, he somehow nails an ending sometimes. In the last paragraph of this book, you sort of don't know what this whole thing has been about. It's kind of a horrible nightmare, and it is about racism and racism against immigrants, written in the early 70s. And at the end, the character who starts off as a liberal kind of university professor who supports the notion of migration and people coming into the country and so forth. The ending is quite disturbing and quite right for the novel. It's just right for the novel. It's not telling you how you should think about things, but what happens to this character, how he changes, all makes perfect sense when you get to the end of the book. Okay, I've tried to explain 2 very interesting, complicated, enjoyable, bathtubable writers, and I think I want to do both of them again. I like reading them next to each other because they're so very different from one another, and I missed a lot of their early books and some of their late ones, so maybe we'll try to keep reading through Harrison and Priest in the future. Okay, happy bathing. Say thank you to Dodo for not making a fuss, and Lucky downstairs for not making a fuss for this whole 13 minutes. Bye.